We're now at the famous Scotty's Castle in the middle of Death Valley National Park. It is incredible that this is built in the middle of nowhere.
We assume that was called Windy.
Look at that.
In Grand Canyon.
So we're going on the tour now.
Well, you didn't. Here, Dan, I think I can do it. Nope, you have to stand up. So, are we continuing on on our day, or are we going home?
That's the one we're going on.
Okay, now everybody always comes up here to see Scotty's Castle. That's in all the guidebooks, it's on all the signs, but there really is no such place. The real name of this house is Death Valley Ranch. You can see that right above the door there. And Scotty did not own this castle. He always just told people he did. It actually was the vacation home of his very good friends Albert and Bessie Johnson, and they were multi-millionaires who lived in Chicago. And when they first built this house, they would come out here for 6 or 8 weeks at a time, and they decided they wanted a nice place to stay, and that's why we have such a nice house out here in the middle of nowhere. 72 years has passed out here, and you can see, there's some cracks in the stucco, and it's aged a little, but inside, the house is just like it was back in 1939 when the Johnsons and Scotty were here all the time. Now, I could have been your tour guide 72 years ago, and this is what I would have been dressed like. Some of you ladies, you might have thought I was one of those young hussies wearing that bright red nail polish, but that was the style at the time. Now, gentlemen, you could have been wearing a couple of different things. You might have been wearing overalls, you might have been wearing a three-piece suit. It all depended on what you did for a living. And you can tell a lot about a person about the type of clothes they were wearing. Most of the guides here at the castle were fairly young like me, and we were trying to make money for college or something like that. We would have been making about $2.50 a day on a good day. We'd have worked 6 days a week for 9 hours a day. Sunday would have been my only day off, and on Sundays, I would have come into the house and I would have sat through Mrs. Johnson's church service. And everyone was required to do that except Scotty. And we'll learn a little bit more about why Scotty was exempt when we get inside.
Death Valley Rock.
Dirt from your hand.
Now, if you were here 72 years ago, you would have been coming to see Scotty. Now, Scotty is the Kim Kardashian reality star of his day. He is famous for being famous. He is not a singer. He is not an actor. He has no real discernible talent that anyone knows about, but he is excellent at self-promotion. So everybody knows Death Valley Scotty. And just like people want to meet celebrities today, they wanted to meet them back then. And this is where you would have sat, paid attention to Scotty. And it would have been in the evening. He'd been in the second chair here. He always wore a big white hat and a bright red necktie. You could pick him out in the crowd. And the first chair would be Mrs. Johnson. She was a tiny little lady, about 4 feet 11 inches tall. If she weighed 100 pounds soaking wet, I would be shocked. She was small. Now her husband, he's just the opposite. He'd be over here on the couch all spread out, all arms and legs. He was about 6.5 feet tall. And if you sat down next to him and said, "Hey, who are you? What are you doing here?" He wouldn't say, "Well, I'm Albert Johnson. I'm the man who built this house." And he wouldn't say, "Oh, I'm Albert Johnson. I'm a good friend of Scotty's." He'd fib a little bit, stretch the truth. He'd say, "Me? I'm no one important. I'm just Scotty's banker." Now, Mr. Johnson was very important. Without him, we wouldn't have this house, and Scotty never would have become the personality that he was, because Johnson bankrolled him. Now, as we would be sitting here in the evening, the fountain would be going, adding just a touch of humidity to the air. This time of year, we might have a fire going in the fireplace. If you walked around the property, you might have seen something called Tie Canyon. It's full of railroad ties. Those were bought after the railroad went out. They dug them all out. Mr. Johnson bought 100,000 railroad ties for $10,000, and he bought them to heat this house. It has 6 different fireplaces in it, so that's what we would have been burning for fuel. He would shut this door. He would then walk across the room and go out the door the other side. And he'd get in his waiting car, and he'd drive about 5 miles down the canyon down to the ranch where he actually lived. Scotty always claimed this house was his. It wasn't. He didn't live here. He didn't like staying here because he thought it was real pretentious. It was real snobby. And Scotty, that's just not the kind of guy he is. But the castle does have its perks. In the morning, if he got up and he didn't feel like cooking breakfast, he'd get back in his car. He'd drive up here and he'd come through that door. He'd take off all his dirty clothes, leave them in a pile, get some clean ones out of his wardrobe there, and then he'd head out here to the kitchen. Well, meanwhile, as he goes on about the rest of his day, one of the maids would come in, and she'd pick up all his dirty clothes and she'd haul them down to the laundry. And if it was laundry day, she would go through, clean them all, she'd bring them back, hang them up, put them in the drawers. So Scotty had laundry service on top of, food if he didn't want to cook. Scotty was born in Kentucky, and his mother died when he was a young boy. His father remarried, and he did not get along with his stepmother. So by the time he was 11 years old, Scotty said, forget this, I'm out of here. And he came out here to Death Valley. He picked this area because he had a couple of older brothers in the area. And they started him out with a couple of jobs, and he did a little of this and a little of that. And Scotty quickly learns he does not like hard physical labor. That is not his calling in life. So he decides he wants to be a cowboy. By the time he's 18, he's migrated up to Wyoming. And as he's up there one day, he's on his horse and it spooks. And he manages to calm it down without getting thrown. And a man watched that happen. And the man watching Scotty worked for the man in that picture up there. Does anybody know who that is? Very close. The other famous Bill of the Wild West. Buffalo Bill, that's right, of the Wild West show. So he's watching Scotty, and he walks up to me and says, sir, I work for Buffalo Bill of the Wild West show. How would you like a job as a trick rider? Well, Scotty, of course, thinks this is wonderful. This is his grand opportunity to be a professional cowboy, and he jumps on it. So he ends up working for Buffalo Bill for several years. And you can see a lot of the pictures in here are from his days as a trick rider in the Wild West show. Now, Scotty, he starts meeting all these famous people like Annie Oakley. Over here we have a signed picture of Mr. P.T. Barnum with the Barnum and Bailey Circus. And he learns self-promotion from these people, and that becomes important later on. Scotty says, nope, I am entirely too smart to fall for that kind of shenanigan. Nope, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is the first man's going to stand here, pound on the door, and wake me up. Then I'm going to get out of bed and grab one of those shotguns you just walked by, stick it in this hole and pull the trigger, and this here is going to slip my shot. Half of it's going to hit the man at the door, and the other half will hit the man at the window, so I can get 2 bandits with 1 shot. Isn't that economical? Do you think that would work? Not so much. You're right. This is an example of Scotty telling a story. This is not anchored in the wall very well, so chances are if Scotty shoots a gun out this, it's going to come flying off the wall, which might take out a bandit, you never know. If by some miracle that held, he might get something back at him because it's smooth inside. There's nothing to split that shot at all. So this is an example of just how far Scotty's going to go to tell a story. But it also tells us quite a bit about Mr. Johnson. He truly valued Scotty as a friend. Johnson spent millions of dollars building and furnishing this home. And he lets his friend drill a hole in the side of the wall just so he can tell a story. So Johnson really knows what's important in life. It's the people and not the things. However, Mr. Johnson comes from a well-to-do family. He likes his comforts. He picks this spot to build his vacation home because it has the one thing you need in the desert, which is water. Water, that's right. About a mile up the canyon, there is a spring that flows year-round. It puts out about 200 gallons of water per minute. And Johnson harnessed that water in a series of pipes that got progressively smaller. And by the time it got to the building behind you over there, it was flowing forcefully enough to turn a Pelton water wheel to generate electricity. So back in the 20s, out here in the middle of nowhere, Johnson had his own electric. I mean, he was living high on the hog out here. Now, we are going to go inside. I'll tell you a little bit more about Mr. Johnson in there. Scotty on the left, Johnson on the right, so you can put a face to the name. So, Mr. Johnson, like I said, he's raised in a very well-to-do family in Ohio. It's a Quaker family, so, you know, he reads a lot of adventure stories as a kid, and he wants to be a cowboy when he grows up, but he knows that's really not plausible. And he does what his father expects him to do. He goes to college. While he's there, he meets the lady who will become his wife. They get married, he graduates, and he decides to become a mining engineer because, you know, that's a good way to make some money. It is physically challenging, and you know, that's something he's really interested in. So, he's going to live out his adventure by being a mining engineer. And everything's going all well and good. And so one day when he's 27 years old, he and his father are in Colorado. They're on a train going to inspect a mine they've invested in. And the train wrecks, kills his father, and it almost kills Johnson. It breaks his back. After 3 days, the doctor said, well, looks like you're going to live, but you're never going to walk again, and you will not live to see your 40th birthday. Now, Mr. Johnson is a stubborn man, and this is not what he wants to hear. A year and a half later, he can walk. He never stands perfectly upright again, but he can walk, he can ride, he drives. He does not let this stop him, even though he is in chronic pain. He does, however, believe the doctors when they say he won't live to see his 40th birthday. Well, because of this injury, he can no longer do that physically demanding job that he once had. So he looks around and he becomes a businessman, and he does what every kid always dreams of being when he grows up. He becomes an insurance salesman. Isn't that fun? You all look like, ew. But he's very good at it. He starts making lots and lots of money. By the time he's 30 years old, Mr. Johnson is a multi-millionaire. Now this is at a time when people were making $4,000 a year, and that was a good salary. So Johnson, you know, he's one of those people that Scotty hits up. This came out of my mind, would you invest in it? And he gives Scotty about $10,000 over the course of 3 years. However, he never sees any return on that investment. And he sends someone out to inspect the mine. He comes back and he says, Mr. Johnson, I don't think this guy has a mine. There's just no proof of it. Johnson makes a couple of trips out here. He never sees the mine. Scotty always has a story. Bandit stole a shipment. He had broken equipment. A flash flood came through and tore everything down. I mean, it's just one thing after another. And Johnson finally has enough. And he sends Scotty a telegram that says, on my next trip, I will see your mine, or my money will stay in Chicago. He starts to think, and he gets a group of his friends together and his brother Warner, and he says, okay, I have a plan, and you fellas are going to help me because, well, I'm supporting you by getting money from these people. So, me and Warner, we're going to go down to the train station and pick this guy up. The rest of you are going to go to Wingate Pass, and when we come through, I want you to pretend that you're bandits. Shoot over our heads, make a lot of noise, act like you're going to rob us. This guy's from the east, total tenderfoot, we can take care of him. Scotty's friends say, that sounds easy enough, we can do that. So Scotty and Warner go to the train station. Everyone else heads to Wingate Pass. Now this happens in February, and it is nippy here in Death Valley in February. So Scotty's friends bring a bottle of hooch to keep warm. And they drink a little bit, and they think about the next day. And they drink a little bit, and they think about the next day. And pretty soon, they decide they can improve on this plan. And they decide they're going to shoot at the wagon wheels instead of over everyone's head because that's much more believable. So they go to bed, they get up the next day, that's the plan. Scotty, of course, has no clue about this change of plans. So when the three of them come through to the pass the next day, he starts yelling, bandits, bandits! And he grabs his gun and he starts shooting. Lo and behold, there is return fire. And Johnson gets excited. It's just like the dime store novels he read as a kid. He cannot believe his luck. Real bandits on his trip to the mine. It must be real. And then Scotty runs it for him because he starts yelling again. Stop! "Stop shooting, you fools! You shot Warner!" Sure enough, there's Warner laying on the ground, shot through the leg, bleeding everywhere. Well, as soon as everybody figures out what he's yelling, they stop shooting and they come running. "Warner, I'm so sorry. Warner, we didn't mean to shoot you, buddy. We gotta get you to the hospital." Johnson figures a few things out. Bandits do not stop shooting just because you ask them to. Bandits probably not going to know your name. And bandits really don't care if you get medical attention of any kind. So they bandage Warner up home to the hospital. He ends up being just fine. But Johnson has some time to think, and he figures several things out. First, he has been had. There is absolutely no other explanation for what he's just seen. But the second thing he figures out is he doesn't care. He is having the time of his life. He is finally living out that adventure he's been hunting ever since he was a little kid. And he has so much fun. He never sues Scotty. He never asks to see his mine again because he knows there's not one. Instead, he hires Scotty to be his desert guide, and he keeps coming out here and having fun with Scotty. Now, eventually, Mrs. Johnson, she gets tired of being left at home in Chicago, so she starts coming out. And it's fun the first few times, but she's a society lady. She doesn't like living in a tent. She doesn't like shaking out her shoes in the morning checking for scorpions. So she says, "Al, why don't we build a house out here? We love it." "Okay, I can do that for you." And he builds her a box. And it is ugly. And she comes out and looks around and says, "Well, it's better than a tent, but we're going to have to work on it." And that's when they added the annex. They built a cookhouse, they built the hacienda, they added the stables and the garage and the chimes tower, and that's when they started buying antiques, and you get the hand-carved wooden ceilings and this yellow set of china that came specially from Italy just for this house. And that's how we get the castle complex as it's known today. Now, Johnson had this refrigerator installed in 1929. Refrigeration was very common in cities at that point, but the closest one to here was well over 100 miles away. So Scotty liked to rush everyone in here and say, "Look at my refrigerator. I have the best of everything in my castle. And look at my 6-burner gas stove. I bet you don't have one of those in your house." And he'd point out a few things here and there. And then he'd go out in the Great Hall and have everybody join him there. Well, after you'd been sitting there for a while, maybe an hour or so, you'd suddenly hear this very loud. And it would stop, and it would start, and sometimes it was real quiet, sometimes it was real loud. And finally, somebody wouldn't stand it anymore, and they'd say, "Scotty, what is that noise?" "What do you mean, what's that noise?" "I told you I built my house right on top of my gold mine. Those are the people working in it. They work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week." What really had happened was Mr. Johnson had made a motion to the housekeeper. And Mrs. Cadigan had gone around, she gathered up all the house servants, and they'd all come in the kitchen. And they'd grab some pots and pans, and they'd headed out that door. They went down the stairs into the basement, and then they started banging the pots and pans together and on the walls and on all the pipes downstairs, just so Scotty could tell people, "Hey, those are the people working in my mine." Yes. And you can see this is actually the end of the big box. Okay. So this is it.
Stairway right on the corner, right here?
This was the outside wall, so those stairs were there, and the other end was at Scotty's bedrooms. They added the porch and the solarium to this structure. And this is her space. Okay, you can see all these baskets we have on the shelves. It's part of her original collection. The bed in the corner, that was specifically made for her. Mrs. Johnson is a very religious lady, and she feels that it is her calling in life to help young ladies who are not as fortunate as she was. She grew up in a well-to-do family. She married a man who had lots of money, and she says, "Okay, I have been blessed with wealth. How do I spread this around?" So she makes a lot of charitable contributions, but that's just not enough for her. So she ends up beginning a radio ministry for young ladies who have left farms and rural areas and moved to Chicago, where the Johnsons live. And she preaches a lot. She writes books. That's why there's a fold-down section right there. She did a lot of her writing right there on that table. And she does a little of this and a little of that. And when her husband begins to be friends with Scotty, she sees a way to practice her Christian faith. She sees Scotty as the mission field. Scotty likes to drink, he likes to smoke, and he likes to swear. All three of those things are not allowed in this house. So she starts trying to reform him. And Scotty, he realizes she's trying to do what's best for him, but he's not real receptive, so he just kind of shrugs her off most of the time. And that's why he is the only person who is not required to go to Sunday services. But Mrs. Johnson is the reason there are tours through here. Because as all the people started showing up and wanting to look at her house, she's a nice lady. She says, okay, I'll take you through the house. And she's the one who starts giving tours. But if you would have gone on a tour with Mrs. Johnson or one of her tour guides, it would have been a tour of, all of these baskets were made by the Native Americans of the area. This rug came from Majorca, Spain. The carpets are from Mexico. And it would have been a very, this is from here, here, and here. And it really wouldn't have been about the Johnsons or Scotty. Now, they continued to build on this house until 1931. And that day, Mr. Johnson gets a knock on the door. And I'm going to tell you who's on the other side. When you head across the way into the open door, you'll come into a room that looks quite a bit like this one. A little cramped. So I'm going to tell you about them, and then you can walk through at your own pace. You can come on in off the bridge. I don't bite, I promise. I haven't bit anyone yet, have I? Now, this first room you'll see, it was not originally intended as a bedroom, but a sitting room. That's why there are so many windows and not a closet. The reason these 3 bedrooms were cheaper is because all 3 of them shared the one bathroom. So after the first room, you'll go into the bathroom, feel free to walk around, look at it. Please do not use it for its original intended purpose. There is not water hooked up to this building anymore. The next 2 rooms, much smaller, but they were bedrooms. They would have been about $8 or $10 a night. I'm going to meet you at the end of the hall in the big room. They did not. Mr. Johnson's train accident crushed his pelvis and he lost his ability to touch it. I'm going to slip right through here. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
It depends. What if you know the energy of the train is doing? However, it's an estimate only 20%. And they send her their generator out to the plant here, if they bought stuff, bought manufacturing plant, but a workshop in Los Angeles where they made a lot of these things. So now they are intended, but at the time they were new, just made the local. Okay, now this room has a lot of really interesting stuff in it. But one thing that I find the most interesting is actually something that's fairly hard to see. But if you look this direction, you will actually be able to see part of it if you look hard.
That's terrific.
That's very good.
Has this place ever been used to film movies?
So the Johnsons, as you can tell, loved music. This is it is a theater organ. So if you had gone to a silent movie, this is the type of organ that your person would have been playing as you watched the movie. You can sit at the console and play. You can sit at the piano and play. However, the Johnsons could not play a musical instrument if it jumped up and bit them on the hand. So usually what happened was Mrs. Johnson would come, pull out a roll of music, pop it in the roll player. And everything that we play now is something that was in the Johnsons' original collection. And they had over 450 rolls of music to choose from. Now, the organ itself, it has 1,121 pipes, drums, bells, whistle, glockenspiel, xylophone, bird call. Chances are, if there is an instrument, it's back there somewhere. Now, I can't prove this, but I don't think Scotty liked this room. It's a very hard room to be the center of attention in. It's got this hand-carved ceiling, it's got the big organ, it has that churchy feel to it, and like I said, Scotty's not a church-going man. So the Johnsons and Scotty reached a compromise. They would open the doors over there and sit out on the lanai at night and watch the stars. They could play their organ, but it was quiet enough out there that Scotty could still tell us stories. Now, Scotty and the Johnsons were friends right up until the end. After the Johnsons moved to Hollywood, they started making long weekend trips up here, usually about once a month. And as they were driving home one weekend, as he usually did, Mr. Johnson was driving too fast. He lost control of the cars, they were going over town pass, and Mrs. Johnson was thrown out and killed. He said that after that, this place was never the same, so he went back to the Park Service, and he said, "Would you like to buy my house and land back, put it in your monument?" They said, "We'd love to, Mr. Johnson, but you know, it is 1943, we're in World War II, we just don't have the money. But please keep us in mind at a later date if you would like to sell it." So Johnson starts thinking, he's never had children, he's not especially close to his nieces and nephews, and if he leaves everything to Scotty, he'll spend it all and die destitute. So he creates the Gospel Foundation, and their job, once he passes in 1948, is to continue their contributions to charities, to keep running this as a bed and breakfast, and to provide tours. And their unwritten job is to take care of Scotty, which they do until he dies in 1954. Now, there are a lot of things we can learn from Scotty and the Johnsons. And I told you several stories about how their adventures changed throughout the years, and hopefully you can take something of that and maybe apply it to your own life. If you have any more questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them downstairs. If you don't have any questions, feel free to wander around the grounds, and we are going to leave through this door right over here. Thank you.